Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, depending on whenever you're doing this. I hope you're all well and that you enjoyed your break if you had one. I did have the pleasure of meeting some of you at Campbell High School, which was really nice. The science students out there, it was absolutely lovely to meet some of you face to face. I have to say I've really missed that with this unit being online. And that reminds me about the feedback, the ISEC feedback. It was, again, incredibly positive. Just one person again who wasn't entirely happy but didn't leave any feedback about why that was. So everybody else was generally very happy with everything. But you did mention that you wish it didn't have to be online. And I'm right there with you. I feel exactly the same. So anybody else who wants to write that at in the final ISEC is more than supported by me in that. Yeah, and the other thing was about the timing. Timing is always difficult, to suit everybody. It's really difficult. One thing I have to say today is, excuse me, I have got a pretty sore throat. I've had a really bad cough and sore throat over the weekend. It's not COVID. I've been tested. But it probably means there'll be quite a bit of throat clearing and coughing throughout this, so I do apologise for that from the start. Okay, so what are we looking at today? Well, we're having a look at personalised planning. Before we start that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of our beautiful country. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders engaging with this presentation. Okay, so as I said, today we are going to be looking at personalised planning. Personal plans are also known as individual education plans, individual learning plans, student support documents, SSDs, ILPs, IEPs, PPs, lots of names and lots of acronyms for them. These are the aims of the lecture. There are quite a few more than I would normally have, but they're quite distinct, sort of short aims. I'll just let you read through those. Okay, so what is personalised planning all about? Well, whilst all students are expected to get equal attention in schools, which is a kind of democratic principle, and to be exposed to the same curriculum, there are some caveats on that, which we'll talk about, and evaluated in pretty much the same way, personalised planning accepts that the needs of individual students are different, and thus they must be differently addressed. So personalised planning is about meeting our legal and moral obligations to all students so that they can all learn and they can all contribute to or participate in all aspects of school. This statement here is about inclusion. It's from the Australian government. And it's about welcoming all students in age-appropriate settings. But what's interesting, though, in Australia is that only some students have individual learning plans to help them participate in school. In some parts of the world, including many states in the US and even some schools in Australia now,
it's compulsory to do an individual education plan for all students. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The development of individual educational plans, or ILPs, ELP, as I've said, they've got many names, aids us in meeting our obligations in the law. So our obligations in relation to the Disability Standards for Education from 2005 and the DDA. Which are, of course, all about enabling students to participate to the best of their ability in education, and to ensuring really that all students are appropriately challenged and supported in our schools. Okay, so I want to focus here on the highlighted statements, really, to enable students with disabilities to participate in education on the same basis as students without disability. That's our aim, and that's what personalised planning and the way it's done in Australia is all about. And you'll hear this phrase over and over again throughout your teaching career, that we're enabling students to participate on the same basis. So personalised planning is not about giving special favours or helping some students to do better than others, giving some students more help than you might give to others. It's about providing access to the curriculum on the same basis to all students. And we've already looked at UDL, and I think there's a lot of links here with Universal Design for Learning. For example, if you're teaching science or you're teaching music, but you present much of your material, much of the curriculum through reading. If you expect the students, for example, to read a lot of material in order to access the curriculum, you're actually limiting access to the science or to the music curriculum for those students who struggle with reading. Okay? If you've got a child with slow processing skills, for example, and you don't allow them extra time on assessments, whatever subject you're teaching, you're limiting their opportunity to show you what they know. And this can result in really poor teaching decisions. For example, you might decide that a student who has slow processing and hasn't finished a test because they've not had enough time, you might decide that they need to be retaught information because you believe that they haven't learned it yet, and that's why they didn't answer the question. And that's just a waste of everybody's time, because they might know very perfectly well how to do the stuff. They just didn't actually have time to show you that they knew that. So it'd be a complete waste of everyone's time reteaching, and it would also limit the students' access to the curriculum in the longer term. Okay, so this is why we talk about this idea of allowing students access to the curriculum on the same basis. Sometimes we inadvertently limit students' access to curriculum through the choices of teaching or assessment methods that we make. Now, what we need to do for our students is make reasonable adjustments so that they can access the curriculum on the same basis as everyone else. So When we're describing or referring to adjustments, there's lots of different names again that different states and technologies might use in terms of adjustments, but we'll go with ACARA and we'll talk about reasonable adjustments. And it's, again, that phrase is there. An adjustment is just an action which we take so that students can access the curriculum on the same basis as other students. There are some sort of caveats around it. An adjustment is deemed to be reasonable if it achieves this purpose, if it allows the student to participate on the same basis in the curriculum. But it does say you've got to balance the interests of all parties affected, including students with disability, the school, the staff, and other students. And that's where things always get a little bit messy when we're deciding, well, it might be a reasonable adjustment, it will help them access the curriculum, but is it too much of a, and I say this word in inverted commas, burden on the school or the staff or the other students? So how do we decide whether an adjustment is reasonable? Well, we use the factors in the Disability Standards for Education in 2005, and it's actually section 3.4.2 if you're interested. And we have to think about, as I've said, any effect the proposed adjustments will have on the education provider, the staff, the other student, and costs and benefits. It's also imperative that the principles of assessment, validity, fairness, reliability, flexibility, are maintained. So where adjustments result in an unfair advantage to one or more students, subsequent disadvantage occurs for other students. So we haven't achieved anything with that. And therefore, that's not reasonable. And I'll give you some examples now of what I mean by that. So the amount of additional time allowed must be justifiable based on the nature and the degree of the individual's difficulties. Now, I actually think this is quite an interesting issue in schools in general. In many ways, I feel like we should have more time for exams. I think perhaps what we should do is have a two-phase exam where you get to show what you know in a certain time, and then you get an extra time, which in which you can show if you know more than that, but you just didn't have time to do it. And then I think with computers we can do that now. We could easily show what a student's achieved in a certain time and then show what they know overall, because not every job needs us to be able to do things very, very quickly. And it's not just about jobs, as I've said earlier. If we're reteaching material to students because we think they don't know it, when in fact they do know it, they just don't have time to tell you that they know it, then it's just wasting people's time. So yeah, the whole time issue is a very interesting one in exams and in schools, as many of you pointed out when you wanted more time for the quizzes. So we can't give adjustments which lower the standards or the expectations of the exam. But, we can think about certain things. So, for example, and again, this goes back to UDL and thinking about, how we can change things in UDL. For example, with exams, we need to think about if we move from a written response to a verbal response in relation to something like a science experiment, then the student's still expected to know the work and to be assessed on the quality of their scientific knowledge. How that knowledge is represented, whether it's on the page or in writing, isn't relevant to whether or not the student knows the science. So if we assess by writing every single time, again, I think I've said this before, then all we're saying to students is, you can't write, you still can't write. You know, if we do it verbally for students who struggle with writing, then what we're actually assessing is that, can you do science? Do you know the principles of science? So obviously a handwriting assessment can't be done verbally. It would be utterly unreasonable to say, we're going to do this handwriting assessment and you're going to tell me what you think good handwriting might look like. Because the purpose of a handwriting assessment is to assess whether or not the skill, whether or not a student has the skill required to succeed in handwriting. So that's unreasonable, asking a student to verbally do a handwriting test, but it would be completely reasonable in the context of science. So individual learning plans or education plans or student support plans, whatever we want to call them, are used from preschool to year 12 in schools. Any student accessing any form of disability education program is required to have an ILP. And that ILP has to be based on documentation that explicitly outlines the recommended adjustments. So, for example, you might have a document from a psychologist. You might have a cognitive assessment of a student from a psychologist. You might have some kind of physical assessment of a student's capacities, whether that's from an occupational therapist. You might have a speech therapist. They all provide documentation. And on the basis of that documentation, you have to produce an ILP or an IEP. When I say you, it will be the staff at your school in inclusion or student support departments who do it. But it's really important that you understand the process by which these are developed. So I know that some pre-service teachers, and indeed some practicing teachers, just want a list of conditions with a list of appropriate adjustments. For example, they want to know that for all dyslexic students, I just change the font to sans serif, I give them some blue paper, or all students on the autism spectrum should get a fidget spinner and some speech recognition technology. But it doesn't work that way. Many students with autism have perfectly comprehensible speech and they don't benefit in any way from fidget spinners. Many students with ADHD don't benefit from Ritalin. Many students with dyslexia don't benefit from Erlen lenses or changing fonts or paper colours or anything like that. So what we need is specific advice for that child, and all documentation from reputable therapists will provide specific recommendations for the specific children that you're working with. And yes, students who have been identified as having a particular condition will share some similarities, but knowing that doesn't necessarily help us in the education context. It's a bit like assuming that all gay men have all the same partner preferences just because they find other men sexually attractive. You're going to know what gay men want to do because they're all gay. It's not like, it isn't like that for gay men. It's not like that for many of these, and I use these words all the time in inverted commas, many of these conditions that students have. Dyslexia is a term for an unexpected and persistent challenge with acquiring and using written language, and it can direct us towards a literature that we might read about how to support children with dyslexia, but it doesn't always tell us very much at all about how the student should be taught, just a diagnosis of dyslexia. And this is why I don't ask you to do in the final assessment, I don't ask you to identify specific imaginary children and write lesson plans around them. And that's why what I'm trying to get you to do is embed UDL in all of your practice and wait for advice from paraprofessionals who have more experience about supporting specific students. Telling you to do this for this type of student or that for that type of student potentially wastes your time and can make invalid assumptions about students, which can lead to dangerous ideas about the homogeneity of certain student groups. So as a good UDL teacher who differentiates well and provides multiple means of representation, expression, and so on, you will have some insight already into a student's challenges and their strengths and some ideas of what seems to work for them. So, you know, you'll get more advice from the professionals, but wait for that specific advice rather than thinking, I know what to do because this child is autistic or whatever. So the process of developing an individual education plan is multi-step. It starts with, it's also, I have to say, it's also about identifying students' strengths and challenges. As you know, it's not just about what their challenges are. It really is about determining strengths as well. And some people may have an individual education plan in some schools because they're perceived to be gifted. But the challenges may be medical, it may be challenges with their learning, the way content is delivered, the learning environment, or whatever. So we go through this cycle. We have a collaborative meeting, and you'll remember the very first slide in this is I am the I in ILP. Your collaborative meeting should really involve your student in secondary schools. Frequently doesn't, but it should, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the tutorial. You share all the information you've gathered. As I've said, you'll get things from psychologists, occupational therapists, and so on, physios, what have you. You're going to identify some outcomes that you want, set some targets, you know, write an individual education plan if one doesn't exist already, and you're going to modify it, implement it, and review it. It's an ongoing thing throughout a student's life in school. And yeah, the stage that often really is very poorly done is the review stage. But again, as I've said, we'll talk more about these things in the tutorial. But stage one, your collaborative meeting. As I've said, students should be involved, but frequently they're not. They're done as some kind of secret thing. And maybe if we change schooling so that all students have a personalised learning plan, as they do in some countries, perhaps there wouldn't be this stigma associated to it, so that every student knew that all students were getting their strengths and challenges identified. And that's not, you know, it's not just a thing that we do to reduce stigma. We would do personalised learning plans for everybody because it's a really good idea for your students. Schools are changing now. At Margaret Hendry School in Gungahlin, children are taught now in vertical groups, K to 2 and 3 to 6. There's no individual year groups. And this requires much more active monitoring of students. Every student at Margaret Hendry has a learning coach. They are called learning coaches, not teachers. And they observe and record each child's learning needs and achievements on a regular basis. And in a sense, it's a much more personalised curriculum. Students go to whichever activity they next need to address. Now, I know what you'll say, but that's in primary schools. But there are examples of secondary schools doing this. Templestowe in Victoria, Templestowe College, does the same. They don't, after the first year, I think they do year 7 as a year group when students first come in. After that, there's no year groups. So a year 8 kid can go to a year 12 lesson if they're capable of working at that level. So we start, that's just a little bit on why we could have personalised learning plans for every student and how that might be a much more successful way of both teaching and of getting around these whole issues about, you know, students being involved and feeling this great stigma about having an individual education plan. You may get agency representatives, you might get Barnardos, or any agencies might be involved in this process. And the important thing, though, I always think, is that whilst you welcome expertise from professionals in these meetings, and I've sat in many of these meetings in previous roles, the parents are the expert on their child. They know the child the best. They know what the child can and can't do, and in which circumstances they can and can't do it. And the whole process is often overwhelming and depressing for parents. They've got these beautiful children whose idiosyncrasies they've gotten used to over the years, and they see the strengths of their kids, and frequently they come into these meetings, and these meetings can be very negative and really all about challenges. You saw in the Axel video a meeting of the staff and the parents and various people involved, which might be one of these, the kind of collaborative meeting that you would have for to develop a personalised learning plan. And the good thing about the Axel video meeting was that it was quite positive. They were talking about the things that Axel could do as well as the things that he struggled with. So then we go on to, excuse me, sharing background information. You might use an NDIS plan, any cognitive testing, as I've said, social emotional behavioural reports, school reports and assessment. You're going to identify areas of need. You are going to do that, as well as areas of strength. And those areas of need might be related to communication, to social skills, academic skills, skills with independence, physical, emotional and behavioural regulation, health and well-being, any of those areas. But as I've said, you might well have a child who has great strengths in communication and social skills, but major challenges in academic skills. And all of those need to be recorded. I'm showing you here an example of a cognitive report that you would get from an assessment that was done on a student. This report was done on an extremely bright child, but one who has slow processing skills. So, excuse me, you can see the child at the time was about, excuse me, was about 11 years old, I think,
or 12 years old maybe. So just years ahead in many verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning was well ahead. Working memory was extremely good, but processing speed was very, very low. 9th percentile is really, really very low. And what would qualify for a diagnosis of special needs in terms of processing, and yet working memory would qualify for gifted. Fluid reasoning again would qualify as gifted, and verbal comprehension is exceptionally bright. So you know, this is a very asymmetric profile of a child. So this is the kind of cognitive information that you would get. And I think it's really important to remember that these are just particular skills and they do change, but that is such a skewed profile that it would be useful to teachers who are thinking, this kid seems, for example, verbally very bright, but just doesn't get anything down on paper very well. It doesn't get through work, seems to be lazy, and that is about this. You can see this percentile rank here. That is about this slow processing issue here. This is another part of a report that you might get from a psychologist. This is to do with what we might term behavioural issues. The psychology reports are very reductionist about kids, and but just so that you know, so you've got some ideas of the kind of reports that you might get. This is actually the same child that we've just seen the other report on, the cognitive report on. And what we see here, when we get into the red block, that means we are over, we're starting to look at something which might be considered a disability. So hyperactivity and impulsivity, we've got here a score of 70, which is pretty high, and that pushes this child really into the area of this child would probably get a diagnosis of ADHD on the basis of this result. No real learning problems. Some evidence of learning problems, but as I've said, that might be to do with the slow processing, and slow processing can result in things like handwriting issues or spelling, because it's extremely difficult to process which way your hand has to move to make the letter, which way round the letter goes, and all the rest of it. If a child is struggling with that, the spelling thing is just like an extra thing to have to think about, and because of the slow processing, they can't do that necessarily very well. It's just too much to take on, which is why you can have some kids who are good verbal spellers but poor written spellers, because when you put the handwriting extra bit into it, even in high school, they just are concentrating so hard on the actual mechanics of writing that they can't get the spellings correct. So this child, as I say, might well come out with a diagnosis of ADHD based on the hyperactivity, impulsivity report. This is a parent rating. Now, usually for behavioural assessment, you will have a parent rating and a teacher rating. It's a very imprecise science. Some parents want their kids, or some teachers want their kids to be diagnosed as ADHD, for example, and they know the questions that they get asked. For example, does your child, they're very transparent, really. I mean, it's questions like, does your child lie even when it's of no benefit to them? Does your child frequently blurt out answers in school? That might be a question for teachers without putting their hand up. Does your child, these kind of things, they're fairly transparent, and when you do them, you can basically get whatever result you want to get, when you're doing the test. All right. When you have got that information from a psychologist, you will get a list of strategies for improving social interaction and communication skills, for example, or improving various whatever has been identified as an issue. You'll be given, as part of the psychologist report, some strategies for improving their results, their outcomes. This would relate to a child who's on the spectrum. So, for example, many children and adolescents have difficulty navigating the social world. Whilst a child understands that social rules and expectations exist, he doesn't necessarily intuitively understand them. And this can make him feel anxious in social situations. Okay? So, the kinds of things we might do: continue to help the child navigate a situation he may have misunderstood by explicitly stating, I think that's meant to be by rather than but, explicitly stating the social rules of that situation. Explain what the rule is, but also why the rule exists and why we're all required to follow it. So this is the sort of thing that children who have been diagnosed as autistic, really explicitly telling them what the behaviour requirements are and why this happens in social situation, what happens, what that child is expected to do, and so on. Use simple, direct communication. So again, sometimes we have very literal students, again, part of the autistic spectrum. Not every child on the spectrum will have all of these things, which is why I say we need to get these reports and we need to see what the best way to help our students is. But some children on the spectrum are very literal and they don't really understand sarcasm. So one of the issues there is to be as direct as possible in your communication. This is the advice from the psychologist to the teachers. Just as a general piece of advice, don't be sarcastic with kids. Just don't do it in the classroom. It's not a thing that goes down very well generally. And so on. So those are the kind of recommendations that you will get from a psychologist. And I've chosen to look particularly at the more psychology type reports, because I think those are perhaps the ones that people will be least familiar with. If it's something physical, like, this needs rest, you probably understand all that anyway. All right, so next stage is to identify outcomes. So we've called our meeting, we've got all our people together, we've had a look at what reports are available on the student, and now we want to identify some outcomes. So we need to think, what are the child's current level of performance in a particular area of need? How's the child performed in the past in this particular area? What outcome is achievable for this child? So it might not be that you're trying to develop, in the case of a student with quite severe autism who's non-verbal, there's no point having a thing, that says so-and-so will partake in kind of large group conversation naturally. Obviously that's not going to work. So we've got to think, what is actually achievable for that child? So here are some examples of skills. So we identify what is the area of challenge, give examples of skills within that area of need. So we listen to a speaker, we follow directions, we express our needs and wants, we answer questions, and so on. And we decide what outcome is likely to be achievable for that student in the time that we're expecting the personalised plan to last. So if the plan is for 6 months, what can that child be expected to achieve in that time? Well, Lucy in this case is going to use a communication book. So Lucy appears to be non-verbal in this situation. She's going to have a communication book, and she'll point presumably to a picture on the book to make requests so that Lucy can communicate to us what needs and wants she has. Gary struggles with communication for whatever reason, and Gary needs to, the needs are about taking turns, having conversations, making friends. We're going to start with a small thing. We're going to get Gary just to greet his peers, just to say, for example, hello to his peers each day. Hello, how are you? You know, that might be an achievable goal for Gary over the next 6 months. So how are we actually going to get there? Well, we're going to set very specific goals. We're going to set measurable goals so we can actually say that whether or not the child's achieved it. They've got to be attainable or achievable. They've got to be relevant to the child's life and to the child's improving function and happiness in life. And I say function in the sense of happiness, you know, that it's got to be relevant to their ability to live a fulfilling and happy life. And they're time-based. So this is happening in the next 6 months or the next 1 year. And to set a smart goal, you've got to answer, you know, who's involved. Identify the team of people who are actually going to be involved in the process of goals. What actually is going to be accomplished? Where is it going to be accomplished? So, for example, it might be that a student is expected to answer questions one-on-one in the classroom, or it might be that the student is expected to answer questions in front of the whole class, but you're probably not going to ask that a child who's struggling with speaking in public, you're probably not going to ask that they're going to, you know, do some kind of public speaking competition or speak out in assembly in front of the whole school or whatever. So where are you expecting that goal to be accomplished? As I've said, when is it going to happen? Yeah, all these ideas. You know, you can ask questions like, why is it going to happen? To what extent is it going to happen? So are you expecting the child to ask a question every day or 5 times a lesson or whatever? And how are you going to know? How are you going to know when progress is made? It's got to be something that students can realize that they are improving in, so that they can stay motivated and on track. Achievable goals need to answer, when you're setting an achievable goal, you need to answer questions like, what are the attitudes, abilities, and skills needed to actually achieve that goal? So breaking it down, what do you need to do in order to be able to ask a question in the classroom? Has this child got those fundamental basic skills? You know, so you're not going to be asking questions in the classroom if you can't actually engage with the content in the first place. So you need to have the capacity to engage with the content. You need to be able to verbalize
your thoughts, you know, these kind of things. So has your child got the basic underlying capacity in order to develop this goal? And what are the steps that need to be taken to achieve the goal? Get a step-by-step plan to achieve the goal. In terms of realistic goals, what's the reason, purpose, the benefit of accomplishing the goal? What's the relevance of the goal to the child? What effect will achieving the goal have on the child's life? So these are all the kinds of questions that you might be asking in relation to SMART goals, in relation to them being specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So let's expand on the goal that we had earlier, that Lucy will develop skills to use her communication book to make requests. Okay, we're going to make that really specific now, and we're going to say, when is she going to do that? During morning tea and lunchtime. What is she going to actually do? She's going to request a particular food item by locating the corresponding picture symbol from her communication book. She's going to pull off the picture symbol and give it to her teacher without prompts, and she's going to do that 90% of the time. Now, I don't know who's actually got the time to sit working out exactly how often, you know, the percentage of the time, but basically almost all the time. So very specific goal for Lucy. We know exactly what she's got to do. She's got to pull off the picture symbol and give it to a teacher, and she's got to do that without being prompted to do it. Then when we've got our SMART goals, we're going to write some plans. I'm not actually going to show you a plan now because there are some samples on Canvas in week 9 modules, and we're going to work with some of these in the tutorial, so I'm not going to show you them now. And then we implement the plan. The plan is there. We've made our plan. We've got to think next, how does this impact curriculum? How does it impact on our mode of instruction? And we frequently focus now with UDL on the mode of instruction, but we need to think about the curriculum as well and the environment in our classroom. I know that when I was at Campbell High last week, one of our pre-service teachers was talking to me about a boy who'd been in her group who was clearly struggling with the chaos, not chaos of the teaching that our pre-service teachers were doing, that was fine, but the chaos of the environment that they were in, that the boy was in. I think the pre-service teacher felt a little bit, she wasn't sure what to do to include the child. And whilst I, as you know, I'm passionate about inclusion, I think that a lot of other things needed to happen around the environment for that student before a great deal could have been done on that occasion. So it's not just about the instruction, it's not just about the curriculum, but when we get these plans, we need to think, what is it about the environment that we've created in our schools that is causing some students to find it very difficult to engage? And then, yeah, assessment that we've talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about quite a bit more. Okay, so curriculum. Most students with disabilities can engage with the curriculum, provided that the necessary adjustments are made to the complexity of the content and to the means through which the students demonstrate their knowledge and skills and understanding. So again, that's about your UDL. It's about engaging the students in areas of interest within that curriculum area. It may be about making adjustments to instructional processes and to assessment strategies. For some students, though, you will need to actually make appropriate adjustments to the complexity of the curriculum content. So it's not just the way you present it and the way they present it back to you. Sometimes it's about you're actually going to have to slightly change the content, but it's still going to be working within the same curriculum area. For a small percentage of students, this will be, but their learning will be just well below the achievement standards. So for these students, you do actually have to make some adjustments to the curriculum. For example, you know, if you're doing multiplication and division, or you're doing indices or whatever, if a student hasn't yet grasped counting, it's not going to work for you to be teaching them, you know, advanced algebra or whatever. So in this case, you can use the general capabilities curricula. And I'll give you an example of what I mean about this, about still working within the curriculum area. So you're going to draw from the learning area content at different levels along the foundation to year 10 sequence to personalize the learning area content. So for example, if a student or a group of students are doing a guided investigation around electrical circuits, you might have a student who is working at a much lower level, and you might say they'll be involved in this. They'll be looking at they'll be looking at the same level of work, but what they'll be doing is seeking to meet, for example, the year 1 science inquiry skills standard, which is to explore and answer questions. So yes, still working in the classroom, still looking with their colleagues at electricity, but with different learning goals. Or you might, for example, teach targeted learning and numeracy skills, you know, through the electrical circuit thing. They might include following pictorial instructions to build an electrical circuit, which would be from the numeracy curriculum, you know, using spatial reason. And starting to understand how to structure an information text. So they're still looking at the same material, they're still working on the same thing, they're included with their colleagues in looking at electrical circuits, but the goals are differentiated, and they are looking, using the general capabilities, looking at learning different learnings. And this is really the reality of the way that the inclusion is done in Australian schools. Okay, so what you don't do is give them a completely different curriculum. You don't say you can't look at electricity. Who knows? Some kids who are you know, not very capable in terms of maths or whatever, some just have a real affinity with you know, other area like construction or technology or whatever. So the aim is not to take away their access to the range of things that go on in life and just keep bashing away at the literacy and numeracy. It's to find different ways of doing those general capabilities, but while still exposing people to the curriculum and to the whole curriculum, and still allowing them to work with their peers. There are some illustrations of practice on the ACARA website. Watch them with care. some are better than others, and I hope that I've given you some ideas about how you can go about looking at how people approach the curriculum with students with disabilities. So we said we can change curriculum, we can look at instruction. How do we modify our instruction for students? And you can look at some of these very specific texts, very specific ideas here. And these all relate to advice that will be given to the school by a therapist and that will be transferred onto an individual learning plan. So the ILP will contain specific guidance in relation to, for example, the type of assistive technology required or the particular format that suits the learner. So, for example, audio books rather than written books and so on. These are all good ideas for you as a teacher in general to think about as well. So the environment, what can we do to make the environment more suitable for some of our students? Well, peer assistance, buddy systems, peer assisted learning, peer tutoring. Alternative equipment and furnishings. I really believe that our, I think especially, and I know I'm probably going to insult so many of you here, but I think especially Australian schools are depressing places. The building quality, it's awful. The lack of quiet spaces to go to, and yeah, I always find it a little bit, I find Australian schools not particularly attractive, I have to say, and challenging for a lot of students. Maybe that's just me. All right, so we've looked at curriculum, we've looked at instruction, we've looked at environment. The other thing you might need to make adjustments to is assessment, and these are all examples of things that I have seen on ILPs or that I've written on ILPs. Again, you will need to make judgments of when things are appropriate and when they're not. Take-home exams could provide an unfair advantage to some students. And it's a really difficult one because so often with things like take-home exams, you're really looking at what social and cultural capital students have, and it just exacerbates inequities for students who come from homes that aren't, particularly academic or whatever. So you need to use these things with care, but and you need to think about when you do them for one or a group of students and when you do them for all students and all those kinds of things. But these are all things that you might see on an ILP. And finally, the review stage. This is by far the most poorly done stage of the ILP process, in my view. It's the most neglected part of the whole cycle, because whilst ILPs do get renewed, they don't always get reviewed. And these goals that people sit thinking about and talking about so very carefully aren't always checked. They're not ticked off. They're not, they're not rethought out. And as there's very rarely systematic assessment of whether or not the outcomes, which is the entire purpose of the plan, are actually being achieved. And it does
make parents, and I know I've been a parent myself in this situation, lose a bit of faith in the whole process of personalised learning plans. And I don't think it's anything wrong with the earlier parts of the process. I think it's just that at the review stage, it seems to just be, oh, well, let's do that for another year or something like that. So, yeah, really, really important that we review, not just renew education plans. Okay, that's it. My voice is just about going again. So we've had a good look there at the whole process of making personalised learning plans. And while you may not have to do that at the moment, it's really important, as I say, that you understand the process, you understand why these things are in place for your students, and that you commit to achieving them and to checking whether or not they're working. So we've had a little look at the sort of background, the legal responsibilities. We've talked about reasonable adjustments, and we thought about what might be reasonable, what might not be. We've described the sort of 7-stage cycle of the processes involved. Looked at some SMART goals, and we'll go on in the tutorial to talk about some examples. We'll have a look at some examples. All right, see you in the tutorial.